There's nothing more powerful than a mother's love for her dying child. When all hope is gone, she'll walk into the devil's den itself if it means saving the little life she brought into this world. Sarah Mitchell faces this impossible choice. In the Colorado mountains of 1882, her son is burning with fever, and the only medicine that can save him lies with Caleb Stone, the feared mountain man who lives alone in the wilderness. Everyone says he's cruel and heartless. Sarah doesn't care. She offers to stay 1 month cooking and keeping house, hoping to earn his help. What she doesn't know is that Caleb has been secretly in love with her for 2 years. Now they have 30 days together, and both their hearts are about to change forever. But will it be enough time to save her son? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden horse lay forgotten beside Tommy's fevered form, its painted coat chipped from 2 years of loving play. Sarah Mitchell had carved it herself with her late husband's whittling knife, back when her hands weren't shaking with fear and her boys' laughter still filled their small cabin in Pine Ridge. Now those same hands smoothed damp hair from Tommy's burning forehead, and she wondered if she'd ever hear that sweet sound again. "Mama," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible above the autumn wind rattling their thin walls. "It hurts." Sarah's heart clenched. 3 weeks had passed since the fever first took hold. 3 weeks of watching her 7-year-old son waste away despite every remedy she could afford. Dr. Henderson had tried his laudanum and his bleeding, but nothing worked. The fever burned through Tommy's small body like wildfire, and with each passing hour, more of her precious boy slipped away. She'd sold her wedding china, her grandmother's silver, even her mother's pearl earrings. The money had gone to medicines that failed and doctors who shook their heads with increasing concern. Now winter approached the Colorado Territory with its promise of isolation and harsh cold, and Sarah had nothing left to sell except the clothes on her back. Nothing except one impossible option: Caleb Stone. Even thinking his name made her stomach tighten with apprehension. The mountain man lived alone in the high country, miles from Pine Ridge, in a cabin that few dared approach. The stories told about him varied with each telling, but they all agreed on one thing: he was not a man to cross. Some said he'd been a soldier once, a scout who'd seen too much blood and turned his back on civilization. Others whispered he'd killed a man in Denver and fled to the mountains to escape the law. What everyone agreed on was his cruelty. Cold as winter stone, they said, hard as the granite peaks he called home. A man who'd as soon shoot you as look at you, who had no use for women or children or the softness they brought to the world. But Sarah had heard something else, something the other women in town wouldn't discuss directly. Caleb Stone knew healing. He had medicines that worked when others failed, knowledge passed down from the Cherokee side of his family. Twice in the past year, desperate folks had climbed the treacherous path to his cabin. Both times they'd returned with cures that had saved lives. The problem was the price. Nobody talked about what Caleb Stone demanded in return for his help, but the haunted look in Mary Thompson's eyes after her husband's recovery told its own story. Whatever Caleb asked, it wasn't something decent folk discussed. Sarah looked down at Tommy's flushed face and made her decision. Decency was a luxury she could no longer afford. The journey to Caleb's cabin took most of a day, traveling on foot with Tommy wrapped in blankets and carried in her arms. The path wound through stands of aspen and pine, climbing steadily into the thin air of the high country. Sarah's legs ached, her back screamed in protest, but she pressed on. Every labored breath from her son drove her forward. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, giving way to rocky outcroppings and patches of early snow. The air carried the bite of winter, sharp and clean, so different from the stuffy sick room atmosphere they'd left behind. Sarah paused to catch her breath and adjust Tommy's weight in her arms. That's when she saw it. Caleb Stone's cabin sat on a small plateau, backed against a towering cliff face. It was larger than she'd expected, built from massive logs that spoke of a man who understood the mountain's harsh demands. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and golden light spilled from the windows, making the structure look almost welcoming in the gathering dusk. Almost. Sarah's courage nearly failed her then. Stories of Caleb's cruelty flooded her mind, whispered, warnings from the women of Pine Ridge. But Tommy stirred weakly in her arms, and she felt the terrible heat of his fever through the blankets. She had no choice. The path to the cabin door seemed endless, each step echoing in the mountain stillness. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the wooden steps to the covered porch. The door was solid oak, scarred by weather, and time, with a heavy iron knocker shaped like a wolf's head. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Once she crossed this threshold, there would be no going back. Whatever price Caleb Stone demanded, she would have to pay it. Her reputation, her future, her very life, all of it was worth less than the fevered child in her arms. Sarah knocked. The sound echoed inside the cabin, followed by heavy footsteps. The door opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with the most dangerous man in the Colorado Territory. Caleb Stone was nothing like she'd imagined. Oh, he was big enough, tall and broad-shouldered, with the easy strength of a man who lived by his hands. His dark hair showed silver at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sun and wind. But his face wasn't cruel. It was careful, guarded, with the watchful stillness of a man who'd learned to trust no one. And his eyes, God help her, his eyes were kind. "Mrs. Mitchell." His voice was deep and quiet, with just a trace of surprise. "What brings you to my mountain?" Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless. He knew her name. How did he know her name? "My son," she managed, lifting Tommy slightly. "He's dying. I have nowhere else to turn." Something flickered across Caleb's features. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. His gaze dropped to the boy in her arms, and Sarah saw his jaw tighten. "How long has he been sick?" 3 weeks. "The fever won't break." Sarah's voice cracked. "Dr. Henderson tried everything. I've tried everything. Please, I know you have medicine." "That works. I'll do anything, pay anything." "Come inside." Caleb stepped back, opening the door wider. "The night air won't help him any." Sarah hesitated on the threshold. Once she entered, she would be completely at this man's mercy, alone, on his mountain with no one to hear her scream. But Tommy's breathing was so shallow now, his small body burning with fever, that nothing could touch. She stepped inside. The cabin's interior was another surprise. The main room was large and comfortable, with a stone fireplace crackling warmly against the evening chill. Hand-carved furniture spoke of craftsmanship and patience, while shelves lined with books suggested an educated mind. The space was clean, orderly, and somehow peaceful, not at all what she'd expected from the lair of a mountain hermit. Caleb closed the door behind them and gestured toward a padded chair near the fire. "Sit. Let me look at him." Sarah settled into the chair, still holding Tommy close. Caleb disappeared into what she assumed was a back room and returned carrying a leather satchel. He knelt beside her chair, his movements careful and deliberate. "May I?" he asked, reaching toward Tommy. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Caleb's hands were large but gentle as he touched the boy's forehead, felt for his pulse, listened to his labored breathing. His examination was thorough and professional, nothing like the rough treatment she'd feared. "Lung fever," he said finally. "Bad, but not beyond help if we act quickly." He met her eyes, his expression grave. "I have medicine that can break the fever and clear his lungs, but he'll need constant care for several days, maybe longer." "I'll stay," Sarah said immediately, "however long it takes." "This isn't Pine Ridge, Mrs. Mitchell. Folks will talk. Your reputation—" "My reputation means nothing if my son dies." The words came out fiercer than she'd intended, but she didn't care. "I'll pay whatever you ask. Do whatever you want. Just save him." Something shifted in Caleb's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. 1 month, he said quietly. You stay 1 month, help around the place, and I'll tend the boy until he's well. A month. 4 weeks alone, with the most feared man in the territory. Sarah thought of the whispered warnings, the dark rumors, the price that might be demanded of her in the lonely mountain nights. She looked down at Tommy's fevered face and felt her heart break all over again. Yes, she whispered, 1 month. That first night, Sarah barely slept. Caleb had settled them in a small bedroom off the main room, laying Tommy on a narrow bed near the window where the mountain air could reach him. The boy's breathing came in short, painful gasps that tore at Sarah's heart with each sound. Around midnight, Tommy's fever spiked. Sarah woke to find him burning with heat, his small body convulsing with chills, despite the fire Caleb had built in the bedroom's small hearth. Panic seized her throat as she watched her son's lips turn blue, his breathing becoming so shallow she had to lean close to feel it at all. "Caleb!" The scream ripped from her throat before she could think. "Caleb, help me!" Heavy footsteps thundered across the main room, and the bedroom door burst open. Caleb appeared in his nightshirt and trousers, his dark hair tousled with sleep, but his eyes immediately alert. He took one look at Tommy and crossed to the bed in 2 quick strides. How long has he been like this? His hands moved over Tommy's fevered form, checking pulse, breathing, the color of his fingernails. "I just woke up. He was shaking so hard." Sarah's voice broke. "Is he dying? Oh God, is my baby dying?" Caleb's jaw tightened as he pressed his ear to Tommy's chest. "His lungs are filling. We need to act now." He straightened and moved toward the door. "Stay with him. Keep him upright if you can." Sarah gathered Tommy into her arms, holding his burning body against her chest as Caleb disappeared into the main room. She could hear him moving around, the sound of bottles clinking, water being poured. Tommy's breathing grew more labored, and she felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please," she whispered to whatever force might be listening. "Please don't take him. Not my baby, not now." Caleb returned, carrying a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. The scent that emanated from it was earthy and complex. Herbs she couldn't identify, mixed with something that reminded her of spring rain and cedar smoke. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said quietly, settling beside the bed. "She was Cherokee, taught me the old ways before the army took her people west." Sarah watched as he opened the pouch with reverent care. Inside were dozens of small compartments, each containing different herbs, roots, and powders. His hands moved with practiced precision, selecting pinches of this and that, combining them in a wooden bowl. "She used to say that healing wasn't just about the medicine," Caleb continued, his voice low and steady as he worked. "It was about intention, about pouring your heart into the cure along with the herbs." He added hot water from a kettle he'd brought, stirring the mixture until it formed a thin paste. The smell grew stronger, not unpleasant but wild and powerful, like the mountains themselves. "This will break the fever and open his lungs," Caleb said, meeting Sarah's eyes. "But I need you to trust me. Some of what I have to do might look frightening." Sarah looked down at Tommy's blue-tinged lips and nodded without hesitation. "Do whatever you need to do." Caleb began by rubbing the herbal paste on Tommy's chest, working it into the skin with gentle circular motions. Sarah felt her son's body respond almost immediately. His breathing eased slightly, and some of the terrible heat began to leave his forehead. Next, Caleb took a small clay pipe from his pouch and packed it with dried leaves. He lit it with a coal from the fire and began to blow the fragrant smoke over Tommy's face and chest. The boy stirred, coughing weakly but breathing deeper than he had in hours. "The smoke opens the passages," Caleb explained. "Helps clear what's blocking his lungs." Sarah watched in amazement as color slowly returned to her son's face. The terrible rattling in his chest began to ease, and his breathing became more regular. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Tommy's eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. "I'm here, baby." She smoothed his damp hair back from his forehead. "I'm right here." Tommy's gaze shifted to Caleb, who was carefully packing away his grandmother's medicine pouch. "Who's that?" "This is Mr. Stone," Sarah said softly. "He's helping you get better." Tommy studied Caleb with the solemn intensity that only sick children possess. "Are you a doctor?" Caleb's expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face. "Something like that, son. How do you feel?" "Better." Tommy's voice was still weak, but he managed a small smile. "The bad dreams stopped." "Good." Caleb stood and moved toward the door. "You need to rest now. Drink plenty of water and sleep as much as you can." "Mr. Stone," Tommy called softly. Caleb paused in the doorway. "Yes, thank you." For a moment, Sarah saw something raw and vulnerable cross Caleb's features, a glimpse of the man behind the mountain hermit's mask. Then he nodded once and disappeared into the main room, leaving Sarah alone with her son. She held Tommy close as he drifted back to sleep, his breathing now steady and peaceful. The crisis had passed, but the events of the night had shaken something loose inside her chest. The man who had just saved her son's life bore no resemblance to the cruel mountain hermit of local legend. Caleb Stone was gentle, knowledgeable, and when he'd looked at Tommy with such tender concern, Sarah had seen something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The next morning, Tommy woke hungry for the first time in weeks. Sarah found Caleb in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled like heaven itself. He glanced up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "How is he?" "Better. Much better." Sarah settled at the rough wooden table, suddenly, aware of how she must look after the long night. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need." Caleb ladled soup into 3 bowls. "He's got good healing ahead of him, but the worst is past." Sarah accepted the bowl he offered, inhaling the rich scent of herbs and vegetables. "This smells wonderful. I didn't realize you could cook." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "A man learns to take care of himself up here, either that or starve." The soup was delicious, far better than anything Sarah had managed in her own kitchen. As they ate in comfortable silence, she found herself stealing glances at her host. Everything about Caleb Stone contradicted the stories told in Pine Ridge. His home was clean and welcoming, his touch with Tommy had been infinitely gentle, and the way he'd worked through the night to save a stranger's child spoke of a compassion that ran soul-deep. "Mr. Stone," she began carefully, "the people in town, what they say about you is mostly true." His voice was flat, final. "I'm not a good man, Mrs. Mitchell. Don't mistake kindness for something it's not." But Sarah had seen his face when Tommy thanked him. She'd watched his hands shake slightly as he'd packed away his grandmother's medicine pouch. Whatever darkness lived in Caleb Stone's past, it hadn't touched the core of who he was. "I think you're wrong," she said quietly. Caleb's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His dark eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment, the careful walls he'd built around himself seemed to crack. Then Tommy called from the bedroom, asking for water, and the moment passed. But as Sarah rose to tend to her son, she caught something in Caleb's expression that made her breath catch. He was looking at her like she was something precious, something he'd thought about for a very long time. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it sent warmth spreading through her chest like honey in tea. For the first time since arriving on Caleb's mountain, Sarah began to wonder if the stories about the cruel mountain man were wrong about more than just his healing abilities. Maybe they were wrong about his heart, too. The first week passed in a careful dance of boundaries and unspoken rules. Sarah woke each morning before dawn, slipping quietly from the small bedroom where Tommy continued his recovery. She'd find Caleb already up, tending the fire or preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. There, conversations were polite but distant. Caleb would check on Tommy's progress with professional detachment, while Sarah busied herself with the domestic tasks that justified her presence. She swept floors that didn't need sweeping, organized shelves that were already orderly, and cooked meals in a kitchen that had functioned perfectly well without her. But slowly, almost without her noticing, the cabin began to change. The simple gold band on Sarah's finger caught the morning light as she worked. She'd worn her wedding ring every day for the 3 years since James's death, a tangible reminder of the love they'd shared and the family they'd built. Lately, though, she'd caught herself twisting it when nervous, sliding it up and down her finger as if testing its weight. This morning, as she kneaded bread dough at Caleb's kitchen table, she found herself considering the unthinkable. The ring would fetch enough money to repay Caleb for Tommy's medicine, maybe even leave something extra for winter supplies. James would have understood, would have insisted she do whatever was necessary to care for their son, but the thought of removing it felt like betraying more than just James's memory. It felt like admitting that part of her life was truly over. "You don't have to do that." Sarah looked up to find Caleb standing in the kitchen doorway, his dark eyes fixed on her hands. She realized she'd been staring at her wedding ring, lost in thought. "Do what?" "Work so hard to earn your keep." He moved to the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup with deliberate care. The boy needed help. That was reason enough. "The agreement was 1 month of service," Sarah said, returning to her bread kneading with perhaps more force than necessary. "I intend to honor it." Sarah. The sound of her first name on his lips made her hands still. He'd been so careful to call her Mrs. Mitchell, maintaining the proper distance between them. Hearing him say her name felt intimate in a way that made her cheeks warm. "You've already transformed this place in a week," Caleb continued, his voice carefully neutral. "The cabin hasn't felt this much like a home since—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. Sarah dusted flour from her hands and turned to face him. "Since when?" But Caleb had already retreated behind his walls. "I should check the trap lines. Will you be all right here with Tommy?" It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. Sarah nodded, watching as he gathered his coat and rifle and disappeared out the front door. Through the window, she could see him striding across the clearing with the easy gait of a man who belonged to the mountains. What had he been about to say? Since when hadn't the cabin felt like a home? "Mama?" Tommy's voice called from the bedroom. Interrupting her thoughts, Sarah found her son sitting up in bed, color in his cheeks for the first time in weeks. His recovery had been remarkable, Caleb's medicines working with a speed that seemed almost miraculous. But it was more than the herbs that was healing Tommy. It was the mountain air, the peaceful quiet, and the gentle attention of a man who seemed to genuinely care about his welfare. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Much better. Can I get up?" "On today," Mr. Stone said, "maybe I could help him with his wood carving." Sarah settled on the edge of the bed, smoothing Tommy's hair. "Wood carving. He makes things, beautiful things. He showed me a bird he carved. It looked so real I thought it might fly away." Tommy's eyes shone with excitement. "He said he'd teach me if I got strong enough." The enthusiasm in her son's voice was wonderful to hear, but it also sent a pang of worry through Sarah's heart. Tommy was growing attached to Caleb, beginning to see him as something like a father figure. What would happen when their month was up and they had to leave? "That sounds lovely," she said carefully. "But remember, we're only visiting. We have our own home to return to." Tommy's face fell slightly. "I know, but Mama, do we have to go back? I like it here, and Mr. Stone seems lonely, out of the mouths of babes." Sarah had noticed it too, the careful way Caleb moved through his daily routines, the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to need no one. But she'd also seen the way his face lit up when Tommy asked him questions, the patience he showed when explaining mountain lore or teaching the boy to identify animal tracks. "Mr. Stone has chosen to live alone," Sarah said gently. "That's his right. But what if he's only alone because no one ever asked him not to be?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. What if Tommy was right? What if Caleb's isolation wasn't preference but protection? A wall built to keep out the pain of caring too much. She was still pondering this when Caleb returned from his trap lines empty-handed. He seemed agitated, pacing the main room like a caged wolf before finally settling at his workbench in the corner. Sarah watched him pick up a piece of wood and a small knife, his hands moving with unconscious skill as he began to carve. There was something mesmerizing about the way he worked. Complete focus, absolute certainty, as if he could see the finished piece hidden inside the raw wood. "What are you making?" she asked, moving closer. Caleb's hands stilled for a moment, before resuming their work. "Horse?" "For the boy." Sarah's heart clenched. He was carving a replacement for Tommy's beloved wooden horse, the one they'd left behind in their hasty departure from Pine Ridge. The kindness of the gesture, the thoughtfulness of it overwhelmed her. "That's very sweet of you." Caleb shrugged, not looking up from his work. "Boys need toys." But Sarah could see the care he was taking with each detail, the way he tested each curve and angle. This wasn't just any toy. It was a work of art, created with the same attention he'd shown in healing Tommy's fever. As she watched him work, Sarah found herself studying the man himself. Caleb Stone was nothing like James had been. Where her husband had been fair and slight, Caleb was dark and powerfully built. James had been talkative and outgoing. Caleb was quiet and reserved. But there was something in the careful way he worked, the gentle strength of his hands, that reminded her of what it felt like to be cherished. The thought startled her. She wasn't supposed to be thinking of any man in those terms, least of all this one. She was a recent widow, still in mourning. What she was feeling was gratitude, nothing more. But as evening approached and they shared another quiet meal, Sarah found herself stealing glances at Caleb's face in the firelight. There was something compelling about his features, the strong jaw, the intelligent eyes, the way his expression softened when he looked at Tommy. More than once she caught him watching her in return. Their eyes would meet across the table, and Sarah would feel her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. Then one of them would look away, and the moment would pass, leaving only the crackle of the fire and Tommy's innocent chatter to fill the silence. That night, as Sarah tucked Tommy into bed, her son surprised her with a question. "Mama, do you think Mr. Stone is lonely?" Sarah glanced toward the main room, where Caleb sat reading by the firelight. "I think he's chosen his life, sweetheart, but that doesn't mean he likes it." Tommy's voice was drowsy but thoughtful. "Sometimes people choose things because they think they have to, not because they want to." Once again, her 7-year-old son had seen something the adults had missed. As Sarah settled into her own narrow bed, she found herself thinking about choices, the ones forced upon us by circumstance and the ones we make from fear. From the main room came the soft sound of Caleb banking the fire for the night. Soon, the cabin was dark and quiet, but Sarah lay awake for a long time, listening to the mountain wind and thinking about lonely men and the women who might choose to stay. The second week brought the first real snowfall of the season, blanketing Caleb's mountain in pristine white that transformed the world into something magical. Sarah woke to find Tommy pressed against the bedroom window, his eyes wide with wonder. "Mama, look! It's like fairyland." Sarah joined him at the window, marveling at the way the snow clung to every branch and boulder, turning the familiar landscape into something from a children's storybook. In the main room, she could hear Caleb moving around, stoking the fire and preparing for the day. When they emerged from the bedroom, they found him sitting at the kitchen table with a leather-bound journal open before him. He looked up as they approached, and Sarah was surprised to see him quickly close the book. "Morning," he said, standing to pour coffee. "Storm should pass by noon. Good day for staying inside." Tommy had made remarkable progress in his recovery. The boy who'd been at death's door just 2 weeks ago was now bright-eyed and energetic, eager to explore his new surroundings. Sarah had been letting him venture outside for short periods, always under Caleb's watchful eye. "Can I help you with something today, Mr. Stone?" Tommy asked eagerly. "Mama says I'm strong enough for light work." Caleb glanced at Sarah, who nodded, encouragingly. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose you could help me sort through some old traps, and maybe I could show you how to read sign in the snow." Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself with unexpected free time. The cabin was already spotless, the bread was rising, and dinner preparations could wait. For the first time in weeks, she had nothing urgent demanding her attention. She wandered around the main room, noting details she'd been too worried to appreciate before. The furniture was all handmade, crafted with the same careful attention Caleb brought to everything he did. Books lined shelves on every wall, not just practical volumes about farming and medicine, but poetry, philosophy, and literature that spoke of an educated, thoughtful mind. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a small collection of carved animals, each one a masterpiece of detail and artistry. Sarah picked up a tiny owl, running her finger over the intricate feather patterns. "Those were my first attempts." Sarah turned to find Caleb watching her from the doorway. Tommy was beside him, arms full of metal traps that needed cleaning. "They're beautiful," she said sincerely. "You have real talent. My grandmother taught me, said idle hands led to idle minds." Caleb moved to his workbench, beginning to lay out tools. "Carving kept me sane during the long winters." "How long have you lived here?" 5 years. Caleb's hands stilled for a moment. "Since I left the army." It was the most personal information he'd shared since her arrival. Sarah wanted to ask more about his military service, about what had driven him to this isolation, but something in his expression warned her to tread carefully. Instead, she settled into a chair near the workbench, content to watch as he began teaching Tommy the basics of woodworking. Caleb's patience with her son was remarkable. He showed Tommy how to hold the knife safely, how to read the grain of the wood, how to work with the natural patterns rather than against them. "The wood tells you what it wants to become," Caleb explained, guiding Tommy's small hands. "You just have to listen." As the day wore on, the storm intensified outside, but inside the cabin was warm and peaceful. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since James's death. There was something deeply comforting about the domestic scene, the three of them working together while snow fell outside, safe and warm and content. Around midday, while Tommy was napping and Caleb was outside checking on the animals, Sarah discovered something that changed everything. She'd been looking for a book to read when she noticed that Caleb's journal had fallen behind the desk. When she bent to retrieve it, the book fell open to a page filled with familiar handwriting. Her own name jumped out at her from the page. Sarah knew she shouldn't read it. The journal was private, personal, but her name appeared again and again, and before she could stop herself, she was reading words that made her heart race. Sarah Mitchell came to town today with the boy. She looked tired, worried about something. Mrs. Henderson mentioned the doctor bills are mounting. Wish I could help, but she'd never accept anything from me. Watched her from the mercantile window. She has the most beautiful smile when she thinks no one is looking. The entry was dated 3 months ago. Sarah flipped back through the pages, finding more references to herself and Tommy scattered throughout. Brief observations, worried notes about her struggles as a widow, detailed descriptions of encounters that she barely remembered. Saw Sarah at the church social. She wore the blue dress, the one that brings out her eyes. Tommy was helping serve lemonade, spilling more than he served. She laughed, and the sound carried across the whole yard. I stayed in the shadows, watching, always watching. The entries went back almost 2 years, to just after James's funeral. Caleb had been aware of her, watching over her from a distance, uncaring about her welfare in ways she'd never suspected. The last entry, dated just before her arrival on the mountain, made her hands shake. She'll come to me soon. I can see it in her desperation, the way she looks at Tommy when she thinks he's not watching. She's running out of options, and I'm the only one left who can help. I've been waiting 2 years for her to need me. God forgive me, I've been hoping for it." Sarah sank into a chair, the journal trembling in her hands. Everything she'd thought. She knew about her situation was wrong. Caleb hadn't agreed to help her son out of kindness to a stranger. He'd been in love with her for 2 years, watching her struggle, waiting for the moment when she'd have nowhere else to turn. The front door opened, and Caleb stamped snow from his boots before entering. He took one look at Sarah's face and went, "Very still. You read it. It wasn't a question." Sarah nodded, unable to find words. Caleb moved slowly to his desk, taking the journal from her numb fingers. "I suppose you have questions." 2 years. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Since the funeral." Caleb's jaw was tight, his expression carefully controlled. "I know how it must look. You've been watching me. Watching over you. There's a difference." His dark eyes met hers, defiant and vulnerable at the same time. "Do you think I don't know what the town says about me? That I'm dangerous, unpredictable? No one would believe a man like me could care about anyone, least of all a lady like you." Sarah's mind reeled. "The stories about your cruelty are useful. They keep people away, keep me from having to explain why I choose to live alone." Caleb moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. "But they also meant I could never approach you directly, never court you the way you deserved. So you waited for me to come to you. I waited for you to need me." The admission was stark, honest, and I hated myself for hoping it would happen. Sarah thought about all the times over the past 2 years when she'd felt watched, protected somehow. Mysterious gifts left on her doorstep, firewood, game meat, medicines for Tommy when he'd been sick before. She'd assumed they came from church, a charity. But now she wondered, the gifts, she said slowly. The firewood that appeared after that first blizzard, the deer meat when I couldn't afford beef. I know every family in Pine Ridge. I know who needs help and who's too proud to ask for it. Caleb's voice was quiet. Your husband was a good man. He didn't deserve to die so young, and you didn't deserve to struggle alone. Tommy stirred in the bedroom, calling for water. Sarah rose automatically to tend to him, but her mind was spinning. With this new information, when she returned to the main room, Caleb was still standing by the fireplace, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Are you angry?" he asked without turning around. Sarah considered the question. She should be angry at the deception, at the manipulation of her circumstances. But all she could think about was the careful way he tended Tommy, the gentle hands that had saved her son's life, the patient kindness he'd shown them both. "I don't know what I am," she said honestly. Caleb turned then, and Sarah saw raw vulnerability in his eyes. "I never meant for you to find out this way. I hoped that maybe during this month you might come to care for me a little. That when the time came to leave, you might choose to stay. And if I didn't, then you'd go back to town and I'd return to watching over you from a distance. At least I'd have had these weeks to remember." The honesty in his voice broke something open in Sarah's chest. This hard, seemingly cruel man had been quietly loving her for 2 years, protecting her and Tommy from the shadows, asking for nothing in return. "Caleb," she began, but was interrupted by Tommy's appearance in the doorway. "Mr. Stone, is everything all right? You look sad." Caleb's expression immediately softened. "I'm fine, son. Just thinking about some things." Tommy studied both adults, with the perceptive gaze of a child who'd learned to read the subtle signs of adult emotion. "Are you and Mama having an argument?" "Not an argument," Sarah said carefully. "Just a conversation about grown-up things." "Oh." Tommy seemed to accept this explanation. "Can we work on the horse some more? I think I'm getting the hang of it." As Caleb moved to help Tommy with his carving, Sarah watched the easy interaction between them. Her son had never known his father. James had died when Tommy was barely 5. But here was a man who could teach him things, guide him, love him like a father should. The question was, could she love the man who'd been silently loving her all along? The third week brought a comfortable routine that felt dangerously like family life. Sarah would wake to find Caleb already tending the fire, coffee brewing on the stove. Tommy would emerge from the bedroom bright-eyed and energetic, chattering about his plans for the day. They'd share breakfast together, their conversation easy and natural, before settling into the day's activities. It was while organizing Caleb's bookshelf that Sarah found the pressed wildflower. The delicate bloom was tucked between the pages of a volume of poetry. Wordsworth, she noted with surprise. The flower was a mountain aster, its purple petals still retaining a hint of their original color, despite being flattened and dried. It had been placed with such care that it hadn't crumbled, preserved like a precious memory. Sarah knew that flower. She remembered picking it during one of her rare walks to the edge of town, Tommy playing nearby, while she gathered herbs for tea. It had been a perfect autumn day, the kind that made her feel briefly content despite her worries. She tucked the flower behind her ear, enjoying its simple beauty, the realization that Caleb had somehow retrieved it, kept it, treasured it enough to press it in his favorite book sent warmth flooding through her chest. How many other small moments had he witnessed and cherished from afar? Finding anything interesting? Sarah turned to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. She held up the flower, watching as his face flushed slightly. "I remember this," she said softly, "from last autumn. You dropped it when you were chasing Tommy." Caleb's voice was quiet. "I thought it was too beautiful to leave on the ground." The simple honesty of his words made Sarah's heart skip. "You've been collecting pieces of my life, not collecting. Treasuring." He moved into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. A man gets lonely on the mountain. Sometimes a pressed flower or a glimpse of a beautiful woman is enough to sustain him through the dark months. Sarah studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. "What else do you have?" Caleb hesitated, then moved to a small wooden box on his desk. Inside, Sarah found a collection of small items that took her breath away. A ribbon that had fallen from her hair, a button from her winter coat, a sketch he'd drawn of her and Tommy from memory. "I know how it looks," Caleb said, misreading her. Silence for disapproval. "I know it's not normal keeping these things." "It's romantic," Sarah interrupted, surprising them both. "Foolishly, impossibly romantic." Hope flickered in Caleb's dark eyes. "Sarah!" A sharp knock at the front door cut off whatever he'd been about to say. They both froze, staring at each other in alarm. No one came to Caleb's mountain uninvited, especially not in winter. Caleb moved to the window, peering through the curtain before his expression hardened. "It's a delegation from town. 5 men. Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What do they want?" "I can guess." Caleb's jaw was tight with anger. "Stay here with Tommy. Don't come out no matter what you hear." But Sarah was already moving toward the door. "This is about me being here, isn't it? About my reputation?" "Sarah, please." "No." She straightened, her shoulders drawing on a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "I won't hide while men decide my fate for me." The knock came again, more insistent this time. Caleb shot her one last warning look before opening the door. 5 men stood on the porch, their faces grim with righteous indignation. Sarah recognized them all: Reverend Phillips from the church, Mayor Dawson, Sheriff Coleman, and 2 of the town's most prominent businessmen. Their presence on Caleb's mountain could mean only one thing. "Gentlemen," Caleb said, his voice carefully controlled, "what brings you up here in this weather?" Reverend Phillips stepped forward, his thin face pinched with disapproval. "You know why we're here, Stone. The whole town's talking about Mrs. Mitchell's situation." "What situation would that be?" Caleb's tone was dangerously quiet. "Don't play innocent," Mayor Dawson blustered. "A decent widow woman living alone with an unmarried man. It's scandalous. Think of what this is teaching the children." Sarah stepped into view, lifting her chin defiantly. "Gentlemen, I'm surprised to see you've made such a difficult journey just to discuss my living arrangements." Sheriff Coleman removed his hat, his expression apologetic but firm. Mrs. Mitchell, we're concerned about your welfare and your reputation. This situation, it's not proper for a lady. My son was dying, Sarah said flatly. Mr. Stone saved his life. I'm working to repay that debt. There are other ways to show gratitude, Reverend Phillips said severely. Ways that don't compromise your moral standing in the community. My moral standing? Sarah felt anger rising in her chest like a tide. Where was the community's concern for my moral standing when I was struggling to pay Tommy's medical bills, when I was selling my possessions to keep food on the table? Now see here, Mayor Dawson began. No, you see here. Sarah stepped forward, her voice gaining strength. Mr. Stone has been nothing but honorable in his treatment of my son and myself. He's shown more Christian charity than any of you, and he's never once made me feel ashamed or unwelcome. She was aware of Caleb standing behind her, silent but solid as a mountain. His presence gave her courage to continue. If my reputation is ruined by accepting help when my child was dying, then perhaps the problem isn't with my choices, but with a community that would rather see a boy die than risk gossip. The men shifted uncomfortably, but Reverend Phillips pressed on. Nevertheless, the situation cannot continue. We've come to escort you back to town, where proper arrangements can be made for your welfare. What arrangements? Sarah demanded. Mr. Henderson has offered to take you on as a housekeeper, Sheriff Coleman said. It's respectable work, and you'd have a roof over your heads. Sarah's heart sank. Mr. Henderson was a widower in his 60s with a reputation for being demanding and miserly. Working for him would mean virtual servitude. Long hours, minimal pay, and constant supervision. It was barely a step above the poorhouse. And if I refuse? The men exchanged glances. Mrs. Mitchell, Reverend Phillips said carefully, the church board has discussed your situation at length. If you insist on continuing this arrangement, we'll have no choice but to formally censure you. You'd be barred from church services, excluded from community activities. Think of what that would mean for your son's future. The threat hit Sarah like a physical blow. In a small town like Pine Ridge, social ostracism meant complete isolation. Tommy would grow up branded as the son of a fallen woman, denied friends, education, opportunities. Everything she'd fought to preserve for him would be destroyed. You bastards! The quiet words came from Caleb, spoken with such controlled fury, that the men on the porch took a collective step backward. Sarah had never heard him use profanity before, and the shock of it, along with the protective rage in his voice, sent shivers down her spine. What did you say? Mayor Dawson sputtered. I said you're bastards, Caleb repeated, moving to stand beside Sarah. Coming up here with your threats and your righteous indignation, using a child as leverage to get what you want. Now look here, Stone. No, you look. Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. Mrs. Mitchell came to me with a dying child. I helped because it was the right thing to do. She stayed to work off her debt, which is her right as a free woman. If you have a problem with that arrangement, you can take it up with me directly. You threatening us? Sheriff Coleman's hand moved toward his gun. Caleb smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. I'm informing you that Mrs. Mitchell is under my protection. Anyone who wants to harm her or her son will have to go through me first. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Sarah could feel the barely leashed violence in Caleb's stance, the predatory stillness of a man who'd been pushed too far. For the first time since she'd known him, she could see the dangerous reputation that had preceded him. This isn't over, Reverend Phillips said finally. The church board won't stand for this defiance of moral law. Then perhaps the church board should examine its own morality, Sarah said quietly. A religion that would condemn charity and punish compassion isn't worth following. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The men on the porch looked shocked. They'd clearly expected Sarah to meekly accept their ultimatum. Instead, she'd chosen to stand with the mountain man they all feared. You have 1 week, Mayor Dawson said finally. 1 week to come to your senses and return to town voluntarily. After that, we'll be forced to take more drastic measures." "What measures?" Caleb asked softly, but the men were already turning away. Unwilling to specify their threats in the face of his quiet menace, they mounted their horses and rode down the mountain path, leaving Sarah and Caleb standing on the porch in the gathering dusk. "I'm sorry," Sarah said when they were gone. "I've brought this trouble to your doorstep." "You've brought nothing but light to this mountain," Caleb replied. "Don't apologize for their small-mindedness." Tommy appeared in the doorway, having heard the entire confrontation from the bedroom. "Mama, are we in trouble?" Sarah knelt to embrace her son, drawing strength from his warm weight against her chest. "No, sweetheart, we're exactly where we need to be." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt the walls closing in around them. The town had made its position clear: conform or be destroyed. She had 1 week to decide between her son's future and her own happiness, 1 week to choose between safety and love. As they went back inside and closed the door against the mountain cold, Sarah caught Caleb watching her with an expression of profound sadness. He knew, as she did, that the choice had already been made for them. No matter what her heart wanted, she couldn't sacrifice Tommy's future for her own desires. The pressed wildflower in her hand seemed to mock her with its fragile beauty, a symbol of something precious that was already fading away. The 4th week began with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the cabin like mountain fog. Sarah went through the motions of her daily routine, cooking, cleaning, tending to the domestic tasks that had become second nature. But her heart wasn't in it. The delegation's ultimatum hung over them all like a sword, counting down the days, until she would have to choose between her son's future and her own happiness. Caleb had grown quieter, more withdrawn. Sarah would catch him staring into the fire with an expression of profound loss, his hands unconsciously turning the pocket watch that had belonged to his father. The timepiece was gold and well-worn, its surface engraved with words too faded to read clearly, but Sarah could make out time and love among the script. "It was my father's wedding gift to my mother," Caleb said one evening, noticing her attention to the watch. He told her that time was the most precious thing he could give her, all his days, all his years, shared with the woman he loved. Sarah looked up from her mending. "What happened to them?" "Cholera when I was 16. They died within hours of each other." Caleb's thumb traced the watch's surface. "My father went first. My mother held this watch to her chest and said she was going to follow him. She died that same night." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "That must have been terrible for you." "It was, but also beautiful in a way." Caleb met her eyes across the fire. They loved each other so completely that neither could bear to exist without the other. "I used to think that kind of love was a weakness, that caring so much made you vulnerable, and now I understand that it's the only thing that makes life worth living." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. They both knew their time was running out, that in a few days she would have to return to Pine Ridge and the life that awaited her there. Tommy had been unusually quiet as well, sensing the tension between the adults, even if he didn't fully understand its source. He spent his days working on the wooden horse Caleb was teaching him to carve, his small face serious with concentration. "It's almost finished," he announced one afternoon, holding up the piece for inspection. Under Caleb's patient guidance, what had started as a rough block of wood had become a beautiful horse, its proportions perfect, its details delicate and lifelike. "It's magnificent," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. "You have real talent, sweetheart." "Mr. Stone did most of the hard parts," Tommy said modestly, "but he says I have good hands for it. Maybe I could be a carver when I grow up." Sarah's heart clenched. In a week they would be back in Pine Ridge, where Tommy would be expected to learn respectable trades like farming or clerking. The artistic pursuits that brought him such joy would be dismissed as impractical, even inappropriate for a boy from their social class. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we'll see what opportunities are available." but Tommy was sharp enough to catch the hesitation in her voice. "We are going back, aren't we? To town?" Sarah glanced at Caleb, who was carefully not looking at either of them. "Yes, sweetheart, our month here is almost up, but I don't want to go back." Tommy's voice was small, confused. "I like it here, and Mr. Stone needs us." "Mr. Stone managed just fine before we came," Sarah said gently. "He'll manage just fine after we leave." "Will he?" Tommy turned to Caleb with the direct honesty that only children possess. "Will you be fine when we're gone, Mr. Stone?" Caleb's hands stilled on the wood he was carving. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'll miss you both more than you know, son. But your mama's right. You have your own lives to live." "What if we don't want to live them without you?" The question came from Tommy, but Sarah felt it resonate in her own heart. What if they didn't want to leave? What if the life waiting for them in Pine Ridge felt empty and colorless compared to the warmth they'd found here? That night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Sarah and Caleb sat by the fire in uncomfortable silence. The weight of unspoken words filled the space between them, heavy with longing and regret. "Sarah," Caleb said finally, "I need you to know something." She looked up from her sewing, noting the serious expression on his face. "If things were different, if I were a different man with a different reputation, I would ask you to stay, not as a housekeeper or to repay a debt, but as my wife." Sarah's hands trembled, making her set aside her needle. "Caleb, I know it's impossible," he continued. "I know what staying would cost you and Tommy, but I needed you to know that these weeks with you, they've been the happiest of my life. For a little while, I felt like I had a family again." Tears stung Sarah's eyes. "It doesn't have to be impossible, doesn't it?" Caleb's smile was sad. "You heard what those men said. If you stay with me, Tommy will be branded for life. He'll grow up as the bastard son of a fallen woman and a mountain hermit. Is that what you want for him?" Sarah's heart broke a little more with each word, because he was right. Staying would destroy Tommy's chances for a normal life. The boy she loved more than her own existence would pay the price for her selfish desires. "No," she whispered. "It's not." "Then we both know what has to happen." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn lower as the night deepened. Sarah memorized every detail of the moment. The way the firelight played across Caleb's features, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his presence beside her. In 3 days, it would all be memory. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, but not the kind they'd been dreading. A young man appeared at their door, well-dressed and confident, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of city education and social standing. "Mrs. Mitchell?" He removed his hat politely. "My name is Robert Fairfield. I've come from Pine Ridge to speak with you." Sarah's blood turned cold. She recognized the name. Robert Fairfield had been courting her before James's death and had resumed his attentions after what he considered an appropriate mourning period. She'd rebuffed his advances repeatedly, but apparently he hadn't taken the hint. "Mr. Fairfield," she said coolly, "this is unexpected, indeed. When I heard about your situation, I felt compelled to offer my assistance." His gaze flicked dismissively over Caleb, who had appeared in the doorway behind Sarah. "Surely you can see that this arrangement is untenable for a lady of your standing." "My standing?" Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. "And what standing would that be?" "Come now, Sarah. May I call you Sarah? You're an educated woman from a good family. This temporary madness can be forgiven, but only if you end it immediately." Robert's smile was patronizing, confident. "I'm prepared to offer you marriage, to restore your reputation, and provide a stable home for your son." "How generous," Sarah said flatly. "I think so, despite your recent lapse in judgment. I'm willing to overlook this unfortunate episode. We could be married within the month, and I assure you that your current circumstances would never be mentioned again." Behind her, Sarah could feel Caleb's tension like a physical force. She could imagine what it was costing him to remain silent. While another man casually discussed claiming his woman because that's what she was, Sarah realized. Somewhere during the past month, without fanfare or formal declaration, she had become Caleb's woman just as surely as he had become her man. "Mr. Bearfield," she said carefully, "while I appreciate your concern, I'm afraid I must decline your generous offer." Robert's confident smile faltered. "I beg your pardon." I said no. Sarah lifted her chin, drawing strength from Caleb's silent support. "I have no desire to marry you, now or ever. But surely you can see, your reputation is already damaged. Without my protection, you'll be ruined completely." Robert's voice took on a wheedling tone. "Think of your son, if not yourself. What kind of future can he have as the child of a fallen woman?" The words hit their mark, and Sarah felt her resolve waver, because wasn't that exactly what she'd been telling herself? That Tommy's future was worth more than her own happiness? "Mrs. Mitchell doesn't need your protection," Caleb said quietly from behind her. "She has mine." Robert's face flushed with anger. "And what exactly are you offering her, Stone? Marriage, respectability, or just the same arrangement she has now, with all the shame and none of the security?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Caleb's answer, an answer that would determine the course of all their lives. Robert's challenge hung in the mountain air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for Caleb's response. A response that would either save them or destroy any hope they might have had. But before Caleb could speak, Tommy came running from the bedroom, clutching something in his small hands. He'd been unusually quiet during Robert's visit, and Sarah had assumed he was working on his carving project. Now she saw what had actually captured his attention. "Mama," Tommy said breathlessly, "I found these in Mr. Stone's desk. He said I could get paper to draw on, but these letters, they all have your name on them." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. In Tommy's hands was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, dozens of them, all addressed to her in Caleb's careful handwriting. The paper was worn soft with handling, as if they'd been read and reread countless times. "Tommy, you shouldn't," Sarah began, but Caleb's voice cut her off. "It's all right." His face had gone pale, but his voice was steady. "She has a right to see them." Robert stepped closer, his expression curious and somehow predatory. "What? Letters?" Sarah took the bundle from Tommy with trembling hands. The top envelope was addressed simply to Mrs. Sarah Mitchell in Caleb's precise script. There was no postmark. These letters had never been sent. "Go ahead," Caleb said quietly. "Read them." With shaking fingers, Sarah opened the first letter. The date showed it had been written just 3 days after James's funeral. "My dear Sarah," it began, "I attended the service today, standing in the back where you wouldn't see me. I wanted to offer my condolences in person, but I know my reputation would only add to your burden. Please know that my thoughts are with you during this terrible time. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you need only ask, though I suspect you never will. You're too proud, too strong, too good for a man like me to approach directly. So I'll watch from afar and hope that someday circumstances might allow me to help you in the way you deserve. Your devoted friend, Caleb Stone." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the second letter, dated a month later. "Dear Sarah, I saw you in town today, struggling with packages while Tommy played in the street. You looked so tired, so worn down by grief and responsibility. I wanted to help, but I knew my presence would only make things worse for you. Instead, I left firewood by your back door after dark. I hope you'll accept it as a gift from a concerned neighbor, not knowing its true source. I dream of the day when I can care for you openly, when I can take those burdens from your shoulders and see you smile again. Until then, I remain your secret guardian. All my love, Caleb." "Sarah," Robert said sharply, "surely you're not going to stand there reading love letters from this mountain hermit in front of your son?" "Be quiet," Sarah said without looking up, her voice carrying an authority that made Robert step back. In surprise, She was already opening the third letter, then the fourth, discovering a chronicle of 2 years' worth of secret devotion. Letter after letter revealed the depth of Caleb's feelings, his careful observations of her daily life, his anguish at watching her struggle while knowing he couldn't openly help. He wrote about Tommy's growth, about Sarah's strength in the face of adversity, about his desperate hope that someday she might look at him with something other than fear. November 15th, 1881. Sarah smiled at Mrs. Peterson's baby today in the Mercantile. The sight of her with that child nearly broke my heart. She should have more children, should have a house full of laughter and love. I would give her that if I could. Give her everything she's ever wanted, but I'm a fool to dream such things. March 3rd, 1882. Tommy fell from the old oak tree behind the church today. Sarah was beside herself with worry until Dr. Henderson pronounced him fine. I was watching from the hill, ready to ride down if the boy was seriously hurt. I would have faced the whole town to help her, reputation be damned. Thankfully, it wasn't necessary, but seeing her fear reminded me that she faces these moments alone, with no one to share her burdens. How I wish I could change that. August 20th, 1882. The drought is affecting everyone, but Sarah's garden has failed completely. I saw her counting coins at the Mercantile, trying to decide between flour and sugar. Tonight I'll leave vegetables from my garden by her door. She'll think they came from the church charity, but at least she and Tommy will eat well. If only I could provide for them openly, proudly, the way a man should care for his family. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she read letter after letter, chronicling a love so deep, so selfless, that it took her breath away. Caleb had been watching over her for 2 years, protecting her from the shadows, asking for nothing in return except the privilege of caring about her welfare. The final letter was dated just 1 week before her arrival on the mountain. My beloved. Sarah, I know you'll never read these words, but I had to write them anyway. Tommy's fever has returned, and I can see the desperation in your eyes when you think no one is watching. You're running out of options, running out of hope. Part of me, the selfish part, hopes you'll remember the rumors about my healing knowledge, hopes you'll be desperate enough to climb this mountain and ask for my help. It's wrong to want such a thing, wrong to hope for your desperation. But if it brings you to me, if it gives me the chance to save your son and prove my worth to you, then I'll accept the guilt gladly. I've loved you for 2 years, from a distance. Perhaps it's time to discover if you could ever love me in return. Forever yours, whether you know it or not, Caleb Stone. Sarah lowered the last letter, her vision blurred with tears. The entire story of their relationship had been rewritten in the space of a few minutes. Caleb hadn't agreed to help Tommy out of simple charity. He'd been desperately in love with her for 2 years, watching her struggle, longing to be part of her life. You wrote to me for 2 years, she whispered. I wrote to the woman I loved, Caleb corrected gently. Even if she never knew I existed, but I did know. Sarah looked up at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. I always felt watched, protected somehow. There were times when I'd look up at these mountains and feel not alone. I thought, I was imagining it. You weren't imagining anything. Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. Every day for 2 years I've thought about you, worried about you. Loved you from afar because I didn't dare hope you could care for a man like me. Robert had been listening to this exchange with growing outrage. This is absurd, he sputtered. Mrs. Mitchell, surely you can see that this man's obsession with you is unhealthy, possibly dangerous. The only thing unhealthy here is your assumption that you have any right to speak for me, Sarah said sharply. She turned back to Caleb, her heart pounding with sudden wild hope. 2 years! You've loved me for 2 years. Longer than that, if I'm honest. Caleb stepped closer, his dark eyes intense. I think I fell in love with you the first time I saw you in Pine Ridge, laughing with Tommy in the town square. You were wearing a yellow dress, and the sunlight caught in your hair like spun gold. I told myself it was just attraction, just a lonely man's foolish fancy. But then I kept watching, kept learning who you really were, and attraction became something deeper. Why didn't you tell me? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Because I know what I am, what I've done, what people say about me. Caleb's hands clenched at his sides. You deserved better than a broken-down soldier with blood on his hands and ghosts in his past. What if I don't care about your past? What if all I care about is the man who saved my son's life and loved me faithfully for 2 years, without asking for anything in return? Hope flickered in Caleb's eyes, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Sarah, this has gone far enough. Robert stepped between them, his face flushed with anger. Mrs. Mitchell, I demand that you stop this foolishness and return to town with me immediately. I'm offering you marriage, respectability, a secure future for your son. What is this man offering you? Love letters and mountain isolation? Sarah looked at Robert, really looked at him for the first time. He was handsome enough, well-educated, financially secure. Everything a practical woman should want in a husband. But his eyes were cold, calculating. He was offering her a transaction, not a partnership. Security in exchange for submission. Then she looked at Caleb, seeing past the rough exterior to the gentle soul beneath. Here was a man who had loved her selflessly for 2 years, who had cared for her son like his own, who had asked for nothing but the privilege of being near her. You're right, she said to Robert. You are offering me security and respectability. Robert smiled triumphantly. Then you'll come with me? No. Sarah stepped closer to Caleb, feeling his warmth, his strength, his unwavering devotion. Because what Mr. Stone is offering me is something far more precious than security. And what's that? Robert sneered. Sarah smiled, feeling pieces of her heart that had been broken for so long, finally clicking back into place. He's offering me love. The word love hung in the mountain air like a prayer finally spoken aloud. Sarah watched Caleb's face transform, hope and disbelief warring in his dark eyes. Behind them, Robert sputtered with indignation, but his protests faded to meaningless noise. The only thing that mattered was the man standing before her, the man who had loved her faithfully for 2 years without asking for anything in return. Sarah, Caleb said softly, her name a caress on his lips. Are you certain? Because once you say it, once you choose this path, there's no going back. The town will never accept us. Then we'll make our own acceptance. Sarah reached into her pocket, pulling out the small silver locket her mother had given her on her wedding day. Inside were tiny photographs of 3 generations of women in her family, her grandmother, her mother, and herself. My mother told me something before she died. She said that love was the only thing in life that truly mattered, and that I should never be afraid to choose it when it came. She opened the locket, looking down at her mother's gentle face. She loved my father desperately, married him against her parents' wishes because he was just a poor farmer's son. They were happy together for 30 years, even though society said she'd married beneath her station. What happened to them? Caleb asked gently. Influenza took them both when I was 19. But before she died, my mother made me promise that I would never settle for less than the kind of love she'd found with my father. Sarah closed the locket, holding it against her chest. I thought I'd found that with James, and I did love him. But it was a comfortable love, a practical love. This, what I feel for you, this is the kind of love my mother was talking about. Robert had been listening to this exchange with growing fury. This is madness, he exploded. Mrs. Mitchell, you're throwing away your future and your son's future for what? A mountain hermit with a criminal past? Criminal? Sarah turned to face Robert, her expression dangerous. What are you talking about? Oh, he didn't tell you? Robert's smile was nasty, triumphant. Your noble protector isn't just a hermit, my dear. He's a wanted man. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to Caleb, searching his expression for denial, for some sign that Robert was lying. Instead, she saw only weary resignation. It's true, Caleb said quietly. I killed a man. In Denver. That's why I came to the mountains. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. You killed someone? A man was beating a woman in an alley behind a saloon, beating her to death while people walked by and did nothing. Caleb's voice was steady, matter of fact. I stopped him. He pulled a gun. I was faster. So you were defending someone, Sarah said slowly. The law didn't see it that way. The man I killed was a judge's son. I was just a half-breed soldier with no connections and no money for a fancy lawyer. Caleb's jaw tightened. I knew I'd never get a fair trial, so I ran. You see? Robert stepped closer to Sarah, his voice persuasive. This is the kind of man you're considering throwing your life away for. A fugitive. A killer. Sarah looked at Caleb, seeing the pain in his eyes, the self-recrimination that had driven him to this lonely mountain. The woman you saved, what happened to her? She lived, had 3 children and a good life, last I heard. Caleb met her gaze steadily. I don't regret what I did, Sarah, but I won't lie to you about what it's cost me, nor should you. Sarah moved closer to Caleb, her decision crystallizing with each step. You saved an innocent woman's life. The fact that justice failed you doesn't make you a criminal in my eyes. Sarah, be reasonable, Robert began. I am being reasonable. Sarah whirled to face him, her patience finally snapping. You want to know what's unreasonable. A legal system that protects rich men's sons while punishing those who defend the innocent. A society that would rather see a woman beaten to death than risk offending the powerful. A town that would condemn a man for showing mercy and love. Tommy had been standing quietly by the door, taking in this adult conversation with the serious attention children bring to life-changing moments. Now he stepped forward, his young voice clear and certain. Mr. Stone isn't a bad man, he said firmly. Bad men don't save sick boys, or teach them to carve horses, or read them stories by the fire. Bad men don't cry when they think nobody's watching because they're afraid the people they love are going to leave. Sarah's heart clenched. He cried? Tommy nodded solemnly. Last night, when he thought we were asleep, I heard him in here talking to the fire about how much he was going to miss us. He said he'd gotten used to hearing us laugh, used to feeling like he had a family again. Caleb's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed walls crumbling under the innocent honesty of a child's observation. Tommy, it's true, isn't it? Tommy moved to stand beside Caleb, slipping his small hand into the man's larger one. You love us, and we love you. And that makes us a family. Families don't leave each other behind. Sometimes they have to, son, Caleb said gently. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the obstacles in its path. What obstacles? Tommy looked around the cabin, his expression confused. We have everything we need here. Food, warmth, each other. What else matters? Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah looked at her son. This wise, beautiful child who had somehow grasped the essential truth that the adults around him were struggling to accept. Love was enough. Everything else was just noise. You're right, she said quietly. You're absolutely right. She turned to Robert, who had been watching this family tableau with growing alarm. Mr. Fairfield, I appreciate your offer, but my answer is final. I won't be returning to Pine Ridge with you. But your reputation, your son's future, will be just fine here with the man we both love. Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. If the good people of Pine Ridge can't accept that, then perhaps they were never as good as they claimed to be. Robert's face flushed red with anger. This is insanity. You're throwing away everything for a criminal, a fugitive. Enough. Caleb's voice was quiet but carried an undertone of steel that made Robert step back involuntarily. You've said your piece. Now get off my land. This isn't over, Robert snarled. The town won't stand for this defiance. There will be consequences. Let them come, Sarah said steadily. We'll face them together. Robert stormed out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah found herself alone with Caleb and Tommy, the 3 of them bound together by a choice that would change all their lives. Are you sure? Caleb asked quietly. Really sure? Because once he gets back to Town. There's no telling what they might do. They could send the territorial marshal, could force me to run again. I won't put you and Tommy in danger. Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of mountains that had become home in just 1 month. Somewhere down there was Pine Ridge, with its narrow-minded citizens and rigid social rules. Here was freedom, love, the chance to build a life based on what truly mattered. "My mother's locket," she said suddenly, pulling the pendant from her pocket. "She wore it every day for 30 years, even after society turned its back on her for marrying beneath her station. Do you know what she told me it represented?" Caleb shook his head. Courage. The courage to choose love over safety, passion over practicality, truth over convention. Sarah opened the locket one more time, looking at the faces of the strong women who had come before her. She said that every woman reaches a moment when she has to decide who she's going to be, someone who plays it safe and lives with regret, or someone who takes a chance and truly lives. She closed the locket and looked up at Caleb, her heart full of certainty. "This is my moment, and I choose love." The smile that spread across Caleb's face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Sarah, but there's one thing we need to discuss first," she continued, her tone becoming practical. "If we're going to do this, if we're going to build a life together, then I need to know everything. Your past, your demons, your fears. No more secrets, no more hidden letters. We face the future together with complete honesty." "Agreed," Caleb said immediately. "Though I should warn you, my past isn't pretty, neither is mine. I'm a widow with a sick child and no money to my name. I'm about to be ostracized by polite society for choosing to live in sin with a wanted man." Sarah grinned suddenly, feeling lighter than she had in years. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" "The best kind," Tommy piped up, still holding Caleb's hand, "the kind that chooses each other." As if to underscore the importance of the moment, snow began to fall outside, thick, heavy flakes that would make the mountain path treacherous for anyone trying to reach the cabin. They would have time to prepare, time to plan, time to become the family they'd chosen to be before the outside world came knocking again. "We should prepare," Caleb said, his practical nature asserting itself. "Robert will reach town by tomorrow. If he pushes hard, after that, they'll likely send someone with authority. Maybe the territorial marshal, maybe just a larger group of men. Either way, we need to be ready." Sarah nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. "What do we need to do?" "First, we make this official." Caleb moved to a trunk in the corner of the room, retrieving a small wooden box. Inside, Sarah glimpsed 2 simple gold wedding bands, worn smooth with age. "These were my parents' rings. If you'll have them, if you'll have me, we can be married tonight, here in this cabin, before God and Tommy as our witness." Sarah's breath caught. "Married tonight? It's the only way to protect you," Caleb said earnestly. "If we're legally wed, they can't force you to return to town. You'll have the right to stay with your husband, whatever his circumstances." "And who would perform the ceremony?" Sarah asked practically. Tommy stepped forward, his face bright with excitement. "I know all the words. Reverend Phillips made me memorize them for the Christmas pageant. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Sarah laughed, despite the gravity of their situation. "I think we need someone with actual authority, sweetheart." "Actually," Caleb said slowly, "in the Colorado Territory, common law marriage is recognized. If we declare ourselves married before a witness and live as husband and wife, it's legally binding." The simplicity of it took Sarah's breath away. No elaborate ceremony, no church approval, no societal blessing. Just 2 people choosing each other and speaking the words that would bind their lives together. "Then let's do it," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Let's get married." They prepared with the quiet solemnity of people who understood the weight of their decision. Sarah changed into her best dress, the blue one Caleb had mentioned in his letters, while Caleb trimmed his hair and shaved with careful precision. Tommy appointed himself wedding coordinator, gathering wildflowers from the cabin's windowsill arrangements and insisting they needed something to mark the occasion. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting the cabin in warm golden light, the three of them stood before the fireplace. Caleb held his parents' rings, his expression both nervous and determined. Sarah's hands shook slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, take you, Caleb Joshua Stone, to be my husband for better or worse, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as we both shall live. I, Caleb Joshua Stone, take you, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, to be my wife, to love and cherish, to protect and provide for, in good times and bad, as long as breath remains in my body." They exchanged rings with trembling hands, the simple gold bands sliding into place as if they'd always belonged there. Tommy clapped his hands in delight, then threw his arms around both of them, cementing their bond as a family. "You may kiss the bride," he announced importantly. Caleb cupped Sarah's face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. When their lips met, it was with 2 years' worth of longing, a month of growing love, and the promise of a lifetime together. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she kissed her husband, pouring all her love and hope into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, breathless and glowing, Tommy grinned up at them. "Now we're really a family." "Yes?" Sarah said, looking around at their small cabin, their simple life, their perfect, imperfect love. "Now we're really a family." But even as they celebrated their union with a quiet dinner and shared stories by the fire, they all knew that morning would bring new challenges. The town wouldn't accept their choice quietly. There would be consequences, confrontations, possibly violence. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb took Sarah's hand across the dinner table. "Whatever comes tomorrow, we face it together. All three of us." Sarah squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Together," she agreed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain in protective white. For tonight, they were safe in their newfound happiness. Tomorrow would demand its own courage, but tonight belonged to love. Dawn came, too soon, bringing with it the sound Sarah had been dreading, horses on the mountain path. Many horses. She woke in Caleb's arms for the first time as his wife, the simple gold band on her finger catching the early morning light streaming through their bedroom window. The night had been perfect, tender, passionate, full of whispered promises and gentle touches that sealed their bond more completely than any ceremony could have done. But now, reality was approaching in the form of hoofbeats and angry voices, and Sarah felt her brief moment of perfect happiness slipping away. "How many?" she whispered against Caleb's chest. He was already alert, his soldier's instincts having woken him before the horses came into view. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They mean business this time." Sarah rose quickly, pulling on her dress while Caleb reached for his weapons. The rifle he lifted from beside the bed was well maintained and familiar in his hands, a tool he'd hoped never to need again, but one he would use without hesitation to protect his family. "Tommy," Sarah called softly, moving to wake her son. But Tommy was already sitting up in his small bed, clutching the wooden horse Caleb had helped him carve. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Are they coming to take us away?" "They're going to try," Caleb said honestly, moving to the window to assess the approaching threat. "But that doesn't mean they'll succeed." Sarah joined him at the window, her heart sinking at what she saw. The delegation from town had grown considerably. She counted at least 15 men, all armed, led by Sheriff Coleman and Mayor Dawson. But it was the figure riding beside them that made her blood run cold. "Is that—" she began. "Territorial Marshal," Caleb confirmed grimly. Robert wasn't kidding about bringing in authority. The walking stick Caleb had carved for Tommy leaned against the wall beside his bed, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that spoke of hours of patient work. love made manifest in wood and careful attention. Tommy had been so proud of it, using it during his recovery to steady himself during walks around the cabin. Now it seemed to represent everything they stood to lose. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, surprised by the calm in her own voice. "We face them together," Caleb said, "as a family." He turned from the window, his expression resolute. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. If this goes badly, if they arrest me or try to force you back to town, I want you to know that last night was the happiest of my life. Whatever happens next, I'll have no regrets." "Don't talk like that," Sarah said fiercely. "We're not giving up without a fight. I don't intend to give up at all." Caleb's smile was grim but determined. "I've spent 5 years hiding on this mountain, running from a past I couldn't change. But I'm not running anymore. You and Tommy are worth fighting for." The horses were close now, their riders' voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Sarah could make out individual words: immoral, disgraceful, arrest warrant, that painted a clear picture of what they were facing. Caleb Stone. Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed across the clearing. "Come out with your hands visible. We have a warrant for your arrest." Caleb checked his rifle one final time, then set it aside. "Stay here with Tommy," he told Sarah. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Like hell. Sarah moved toward the door, her chin set with stubborn determination. "We're in this together, remember? Besides, they can't arrest me for marrying the man I love." "Sarah, no." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with fierce protectiveness. "They want to tear our family apart. They'll have to go through me first." Tommy appeared beside them, still clutching his wooden horse but standing tall and brave despite his fear. "I want to go too. We're a family now. Families stick together." Looking at her 7-year-old son and her new husband, Sarah felt her heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. They were about to face the fight of their lives, but they would face it united. "All right," Caleb said quietly. "Together." They walked to the front door as one, husband, wife, and child, bound by love and determination. Caleb opened the door slowly, his hands visible but his stance confident. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting on Tommy's shoulder, presenting a united front to the armed men gathered in their yard. The sight that greeted them was intimidating by design. 15 men on horseback, all armed, arranged in a semicircle that spoke of military precision. The territorial marshal sat his horse. In the center of the formation, a lean man with cold eyes and a badge that gleamed silver in the morning sun. "Caleb Stone," the marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of murder in the 1st degree. You will surrender yourself immediately." "Marshal," Caleb said calmly, "I assume you're referring to the incident in Denver 5 years ago." "I am. The charges have never been dropped. You're a fugitive from justice, and your time running is over." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Marshal, I'm Sarah Stone, Caleb's wife. Before you proceed with this arrest, I think there are some facts you should know." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "Wife? When did this marriage take place?" "Last night. We were wed according to Colorado Territory common law, before God and witnesses." Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. "My husband is an honorable man who acted in defense of an innocent woman. If there's justice to be found here, it should start with the truth." "The truth," Mayor Dawson called out, "is that you've been living in sin with a wanted criminal, corrupting your son and bringing shame on our entire community." "The truth," Sarah shot back, "is that my husband saved my child's life when your community's so-called Christian charity failed to help a dying boy." The confrontation was escalating quickly, voices rising on both sides. Sarah could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm about to break. These men hadn't come for a discussion, they'd come for a reckoning. But as she stood there facing down 15 armed men, Sarah felt something unexpected. Not fear, but rage. Righteous, burning rage at the injustice of it all. Her husband, the man who had loved her faithfully for 2 years, who had saved her son's life, who had offered her a love deeper than anything she'd ever known, was being treated like a criminal for defending an innocent woman. "You know what I think," she said, her voice rising with passion. "I think you're all cowards. Cowards who would rather destroy a good man than admit that your precious system of justice failed. Cowards who would rather see a woman beaten to death than risk offending the powerful. Cowards who would tear apart a family rather than acknowledge that love is more important than your narrow-minded rules." The words rang out across the mountain clearing like a battle cry. Behind her, Sarah felt Caleb's steady presence, his quiet strength supporting her courage. Beside her, Tommy stood brave and true, his small hand finding hers. Whatever happened next, they would face it as a family. The marshal raised his hand for silence, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Mrs. Stone, your loyalty to your husband is admirable, but it doesn't change the facts. A man is dead and your husband killed him. That's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of law." "Then let's talk about the law," Sarah said steadily. "Let's talk about justice." The marshal studied Sarah for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Behind him, the men from Pine Ridge were growing restless, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold morning air. "You want to talk about justice, Mrs. Stone?" the marshal said finally. "Very well. Tell me what you know about your husband's crime." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. "I know that my husband saw a woman being beaten to death in an alley. I know that he intervened when no one else would. I know that the man who was beating her, the man Caleb was forced to kill in self-defense, was Judge Harrison's son." A murmur ran through the assembled men. The marshal's eyes sharpened. "Go on." "I know that Judge Harrison used his influence to ensure my husband would never receive a fair trial. I know that Caleb ran not because he was guilty, but because he was a half-Cherokee soldier with no money and no connections, facing a system that had already decided his fate." "That's enough," Mayor Dawson shouted. "Marshal, are you going to let this woman turn a simple arrest into a political discussion?" But the marshal held up his hand for silence, his attention focused entirely on Sarah. "What else do you know?" "Mrs. Stone." Sarah felt Caleb's tension behind her, his surprise that she was revealing so much. But she pressed on, following an instinct that told her their only chance lay in complete honesty. "I know that the woman my husband saved went on to have 3 children and a good life. I know that Judge Harrison's son had beaten women before, and would have done it again if he hadn't been stopped. And I know that my husband has carried the guilt of taking a life for 5 years, even though he did the right thing." The marshal dismounted from his horse, approaching the porch with slow, deliberate steps. "Mrs. Stone, you seem to know quite a lot about a case that happened before you met your husband." "I know because I made it my business to know." Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. "When I found out about Caleb's past, I didn't just accept his word for what happened. I wrote letters, asked questions, found people who remembered the incident. Do you want to know what I discovered?" "Very much." Sarah reached into her pocket, pulling out several folded papers. "These are sworn statements from 3 witnesses to the beating, witnesses who were never called to testify at the inquest. They all tell the same story. Judge Harrison's son was drunk, violent, and would have killed that woman if Caleb hadn't intervened." She handed the papers to the marshal, who examined them with obvious surprise. "Where did you get these?" "From the woman herself. Her name is Mary Catherine O'Brien, and she lives in Denver with her husband and children. She's been trying to clear my husband's name for 5 years, but no one would listen to the testimony of a poor Irish woman against a judge's family." The marshal read through the statements, his expression growing more thoughtful with each page. Behind him, Sheriff Coleman shifted nervously in his saddle. "Marshal," Coleman called out, "whatever those papers say, the fact remains that Stone is a fugitive from justice. He needs to face trial." "Actually," the marshal said slowly, "I'm not so sure about that." He looked up from the papers, his gaze moving between Sarah and Caleb. "Mr. Stone, these statements paint a very different picture of what happened in Denver. If they're authentic, and they appear to be, then you may have grounds for appealing." "Your case. Appeals cost money," Caleb said quietly. "Money I don't have." "Money we don't have," Sarah corrected firmly. "But that doesn't mean we can't fight this." The marshal folded the statements carefully, tucking them into his coat. "Mr. Stone, I'm placing you under arrest, but I'm also recommending that the territorial governor review your case. These new witnesses could change everything." "No!" Robert Fairfield's voice cut across the clearing. Sarah hadn't noticed him among the mounted men, but now he pushed his horse forward, his face flushed with anger. "Marshal, you can't seriously be considering the word of some Irish woman and a few questionable documents over the judgment of a territorial judge." "I'm considering evidence, Mr. Fairfield, something that seems to have been overlooked 5 years ago." "This is ridiculous," Mayor Dawson sputtered. "Marshal, we didn't ride all this way to listen to excuses and sob stories. We came to arrest a criminal and restore order to our community." "Your community," Sarah said, her voice carrying across. "The clearing, with quiet force, seems more interested in maintaining order than seeking justice." She stepped down from the porch, moving closer to the mounted men. Behind her, she could feel Caleb's tension, his readiness to protect her if the situation turned violent. But Sarah had moved beyond fear into something stronger, a fierce determination. To protect her family and the love they'd found together. "You want to know what's criminal?" she continued, her voice rising with passion. "It's criminal that a good man has spent 5 years hiding in these mountains for the crime of defending an innocent woman. It's criminal that a community would rather tear apart a family than admit they might have been wrong. It's criminal that you're more concerned with your precious reputations than with the truth." The 2 simple gold wedding rings on her finger caught the morning light as she gestured, Caleb's parents' rings, symbols of a love that had endured every trial life could throw at it. Looking at them gave Sarah strength, reminded her that she was fighting not just for her present happiness, but for the future of her family. "My husband is not a criminal," she said, her voice steady and sure. "He's a man who was willing to risk everything to save an innocent life. If that makes him dangerous to your way of thinking, then perhaps you should examine what your way of thinking is really worth." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind through the pine, trees and the nervous stamping of horses. Sarah could see the uncertainty on some faces, the way her words had planted seeds of doubt in minds that had come prepared for a simple arrest. Finally, the marshal spoke. "Mr. Stone, I'm still obligated to take you into custody while this matter is reviewed, but given these new circumstances, I'm prepared to recommend bail and an expedited hearing." "How long?" Caleb asked. "Could be weeks, could be months." The marshal's expression was apologetic but firm. "The territorial justice system isn't known for its speed." Sarah felt her heart breaking all over again. Just when they'd found each other, just when they'd finally become a family, the law was going to tear them apart anyway. The injustice of it made her want to scream. But then Tommy stepped forward, still clutching his wooden horse, his young voice clear and strong in the mountain air. "Marshal," he said politely, "if you take my Papa Caleb away, what happens to my mama and me?" The simple question, asked with such innocent trust, seemed to hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Several shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, suddenly unable to meet the eyes of the 7-year-old boy who had just called a wanted fugitive Papa. "Well," the marshal said slowly, "I suppose you and your mother would return to Pine Ridge." "But Papa Caleb is family now," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Families are supposed to stay together. You wouldn't separate a family, would you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked around at the faces of the men who had come to destroy her happiness, seeing something she hadn't expected: shame. These were fathers themselves, men who understood the bond between parent and child, the sacred nature of family ties. Love all. Boy has a point, the marshal said quietly. Mrs. Stone, you have the right to remain with your husband during his incarceration, if you choose. In jail? Sarah's voice was small. I'm afraid so. Unless... The marshal paused, clearly wrestling with something. Mr. Stone, would you be willing to surrender yourself voluntarily and remain in Pine Ridge under house arrest while your case is reviewed? With your wife and son, of course. It was more than Sarah had dared hope for, but she could see the trap hidden in the offer. House arrest in Pine Ridge would mean constant supervision, community hostility, social isolation. They would be prisoners in their own lives, treated as pariahs by the very people who should have been their neighbors. No, Sarah said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. That's not good enough. The marshal frowned. Mrs. Stone. I said no. Sarah moved to stand beside Caleb, taking his hand in hers. My husband and I have done nothing wrong. We've committed no crime except falling in love and choosing to build a life together. If the law wants to punish us for that, then the law is wrong. She turned to face the assembled men, her voice carrying with the force of absolute conviction. We're not going anywhere. The words, "We're not going anywhere," echoed across the mountain clearing like a declaration of war. Sarah felt Caleb's hand tighten around hers, felt Tommy move closer to their sides, and knew that whatever happened next, they would face it as the family they had chosen to become. The marshal studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. Mrs. Stone, you're placing me in a very difficult position. No, Sarah said firmly. I'm placing you in a position where you have to choose between following orders blindly and doing what's right, between upholding the letter of the law and serving justice. Behind the marshal, she could see the men from Pine Ridge growing increasingly agitated. They had come expecting a simple arrest, a quick resolution to what they saw as a moral crisis in their community. Instead, they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about justice, family, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Sarah, Caleb said quietly, you don't have to do this. I can go with them. No. She turned to face her husband, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. I told you last night that we face everything together. I meant it. The marshal cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the immediate crisis. Mr. Stone, Mrs. Stone, I appreciate your commitment to each other, but the law is the law. I have a warrant, and I'm obligated to serve it. Then serve it, Sarah said simply. But you should know that if you arrest my husband, you'll have to arrest me too. And probably Tommy as well, since we have nowhere else to go. Mama, Tommy said suddenly, tugging on her skirt. Look. Sarah followed her son's gaze and felt her breath catch. Coming up the mountain path was another group of riders, but these were different from the angry delegation that had come to arrest Caleb. She recognized the lead rider immediately. Dr. Henderson from Pine Ridge, the same doctor who had been unable to save Tommy from his fever, but it was the woman riding beside him that made Sarah's heart leap with hope. A small, auburn-haired woman in a traveling dress, her face kind but determined. Even at this distance, Sarah could see the family resemblance, the same delicate features, the same intelligent eyes that she remembered from the photograph in Caleb's letters. Mary Catherine O'Brien, she whispered. Caleb's entire body went rigid with shock. That's impossible. She lives in Denver. Not anymore. Dr. Henderson called out as the second group approached. Mrs. O'Brien has traveled quite a distance to be here today. She says she has something urgent to discuss with the territorial authorities. The marshal turned to watch the approaching riders, his expression cautious. Dr. Henderson, what's the meaning of this? This lady came to my office yesterday, Dr. Henderson explained as he dismounted. She had some very interesting things to say about Mr. Stone and the events in Denver 5 years ago. Mary Catherine O'Brien slid gracefully from her horse, her movements showing the confidence of a woman who had traveled far and faced down significant obstacles to be here. She was older than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of practical beauty that spoke of strength rather than ornament. "Marshall," she said, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent, "I'm Mary Catherine O'Brien. I believe you have some questions about the death of William Harrison in Denver, 1877. Mrs. O'Brien," the marshal said carefully, "I understand you've provided some written testimony." "Written testimony is only the beginning," Mary interrupted. Firmly, "I've come to tell you the truth about what happened that night and about the man you're trying to arrest." She walked directly to where Caleb stood with his family, her eyes never leaving his face. "Hello, Caleb. It's been a long time." "Mary." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. "What are you doing here?" "What I should have done 5 years ago," she said simply, "fighting for the man who saved my life." Mary turned to address the marshal directly, her bearing regal despite her simple traveling clothes. "Marshal, you're looking at a woman who owes her life to Caleb Stone. On the night of October 15th, 1877, I was being beaten to death in an alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon by William Harrison. He was drunk, violent, and if Mr. Stone hadn't intervened, I would have died in that alley." "Mrs. O'Brien," Mayor Dawson called out, "we've heard these claims before. Have you?" Mary's voice cut across his protests like a blade. "Have you heard that William Harrison had beaten 3 other women in the months before he attacked me? Have you heard that his father, Judge Harrison, used his influence to keep those incidents out of the newspapers? Have you heard that I tried to testify at the inquest and was told that my word as a saloon girl wasn't worth considering?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mary reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I have statements from those other women. I have medical records documenting their injuries. I have testimony from witnesses who saw William Harrison's pattern of violence against women." She held up the folder for all to see. "I have 5 years' worth of evidence that proves Caleb Stone killed a dangerous man in defense of an innocent life." She walked closer to the marshal, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more weight than shouting would have. "More than that, Marshal, I have a confession to make. I didn't just travel here to clear Mr. Stone's name. I traveled here because my husband, who is very much alive and very much in love with me, wants to thank the man who saved his wife's life. We have 3 children now, Marshal. 3 beautiful children who exist because Caleb Stone had the courage to do what was right when no one else would." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched this remarkable woman fight for her husband's freedom. Beside her, Caleb stood, frozen with shock and hope in equal measure. "Mrs. O'Brien," the marshal said slowly, "these are serious allegations about judicial misconduct." "They're not allegations," Mary interrupted. "They're facts. Facts that I'm prepared to swear to in any court in the territory. Facts that I should have fought for 5 years ago instead of letting a good man suffer. For doing what any decent person should do." She turned to look at Sarah, her expression warm with understanding. "Mrs. Stone, you have a good man there. A man who saved my life and asked for nothing in return except the knowledge that he'd done the right thing. Don't let them take him. If from you..." The marshal stood silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he'd heard. Behind him, the men from Pine Ridge were shifting restlessly, their righteous anger beginning to crumble in the face of Mary's testimony. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Stone, in light of this new evidence, I'm prepared to recommend that all charges against you be dropped. The territorial governor will need to review the case, but I believe you'll find justice at last." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not of pain, but of overwhelming relief. She felt her knees weaken, felt Caleb's strong arms catch her as joy threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Really?" Tommy's voice was small, hopeful. "Papa, Caleb doesn't have to go to jail." "No, son," the marshal said gently. "I don't believe he does." 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning, Sarah stood on the porch of their mountain cabin watching Tommy teach his baby sister how to hold a paintbrush. The child, Emma Catherine Stone, named for both Mary O'Brien and Caleb's grandmother, was too young to actually paint, but she seemed fascinated by the bright colors Tommy was using to decorate the wooden toys Caleb carved for the children. In Pine Ridge, the charges against Caleb had been officially dropped 2 weeks after Mary's testimony. Judge Harrison had been quietly removed from the bench, and the territorial governor had issued a formal apology for the miscarriage of justice. But more than legal vindication, they had found something precious: acceptance. The people of Pine Ridge had been slow to change their minds about the mountain hermit and the widow who had chosen love over respectability. But children have a way of changing hearts, and when word spread that Caleb Stone was carving toys for every child in town, beautiful, intricate pieces that he gave away without charge, attitudes began to shift. Now their cabin regularly welcomed visitors, children who came to learn wood carving, women who sought Caleb's healing knowledge, men who found his mountain wisdom valuable for their own struggles. They had become, quite by accident, the heart of a community that stretched far beyond the narrow confines of Pine Ridge. "Mama," Tommy called from his place at the small easel Caleb had built for him, "do you think Mary and her family will come visit us this summer?" "I hope so," Sarah said, one hand resting on her growing belly, where their second child grew strong and healthy. "I'd like Emma to meet the brave lady who helped save Papa Caleb." A rough sketch hung on the cabin wall, a family portrait drawn by a traveling artist who had captured them in a moment of perfect happiness. Caleb sat in his favorite chair with Emma on his lap, while Sarah stood behind them with her hand on Tommy's shoulder. All 4 faces glowed with contentment, love, and the deep peace that comes from choosing what matters most. Looking at that sketch now, Sarah remembered the fevered prayer that had brought her to this mountain a year ago. She had prayed for someone to save her dying child, never imagining that in saving Tommy, she would also save herself. "Caleb," she called to her husband, who was splitting wood near the barn. He looked up, his face lighting with the smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "Yes, love. Come here. I want to tell you something." He set down his axe and walked to the porch, pulling her into his arms with the easy affection of a man who had learned to trust in love's permanence. "What is it?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Sarah leaned into his strength, looking out at the mountains that had given them shelter, at the children who had given them purpose, at the life they had built together from nothing more than desperate hope and stubborn love. "I was just thinking," she said, "about prayers and second chances and the way love finds us when we need it most." Caleb's arms tightened around her. And I was thinking that sometimes the best prayers are the ones that get answered in ways we never expected." As the sun set behind the Colorado peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Stone family gathered on their porch to watch the daily miracle of another day ending in peace. Tommy chattered about his painting. Emma gurgled contentedly in her father's arms, and Sarah rested against her husband's shoulder, her heart full of gratitude for the month that had changed everything. She had come to the mountain to save her son's life. Instead, she had found something infinitely more precious, a love that was worth fighting for, a family that was worth protecting, and a future that promised nothing but endless possibilities. In the distance, a wolf howled its evening song to the darkening sky, and Sarah smiled, remembering the night she had first knocked on a lonely mountain man's door. She had been desperate then, broken by loss and fear and the weight of trying to carry the world on her shoulders. Now she knew the truth that her mother had tried to teach her all those years ago. Love really was the only thing that mattered. Everything else, security, reputation, social acceptance, was just noise. What mattered was this: a good man's strong arms around her, children's laughter echoing off mountain walls, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The prayer that had brought her here had been answered beyond her wildest dreams. She had asked for someone to save her dying child. Instead, she had found a man who saved them both, Tommy from fever and Sarah from a life of quiet. Desperation disguised as respectability. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Caleb's voice rumbled against her ear. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Stone?" "Just remembering," Sarah said softly. "Remembering the night I climbed this mountain with a sick child in my arms, certain I was walking into the devil's den." And instead, Sarah tilted her head to look up at her husband's face, seeing the love there that had sustained her through every trial, every doubt, every moment when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. "Instead, I found my guardian angel, a man who had been watching over us for 2 years, loving us from a distance, waiting for the moment when we would need him most." Tommy looked up from his painting, his face serious with the wisdom that only children possess. "Do you think God planned it that way, Mama? Do you think he knew all along that we belonged together?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment, the fever that had nearly killed Tommy but ultimately saved them all, the desperate journey up a mountain path that had led not to heartbreak, but to happiness, the month that was supposed to end in goodbye, but instead became the beginning of everything. "I think," she said finally, "that sometimes the best plans are the ones we're too frightened to make ourselves. Sometimes we need something bigger than our own courage to push us toward the love we're meant to find." Emma chose that moment to reach for her mother with tiny, grasping fingers, and Sarah took her daughter into her arms, marveling at the perfect weight of her, the sweet scent of baby skin and mountain air. "1 year ago," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, "I thought my life was over. I thought I was condemned to struggle alone until the day I died." "And now?" Caleb asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Now, I know that life doesn't end when we think it does. Sometimes it just pauses, waiting for the right moment to begin again." As if in response to her words, Emma gurgled happily and reached for the golden locket at Sarah's throat, the same locket that had given her courage to choose love over safety, passion over practicality. 3 generations of strong women smiled. From the tiny photographs inside, women who had taught her that happiness was worth fighting for. "I love you," Sarah said, the words encompassing not just Caleb, but their entire, strange, wonderful, hard-won family. "All of you, more than I ever thought it was possible to love anything." "We love you too, Mama," Tommy said solemnly, "forever and always." As the mountains settled into peaceful darkness around them, the Stone family remained on their porch, reluctant to end a perfect day. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Caleb's healing practice was growing, requiring longer journeys to distant settlements. Sarah's writing had found an audience among Eastern women hungry for stories of Western courage and romance. Tommy's artistic talents were developing in ways that might eventually take him to cities and schools far from their mountain home. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was only this: a family gathered together under an endless sky, surrounded by the peace that comes from choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, courage over comfort. "Come on," Caleb said finally, standing and extending his hand to help Sarah up. "Let's go inside. Tomorrow's another day, and we'll face it together." "Together," Sarah agreed, taking his hand and feeling the solid warmth of the gold ring that bound them. Always together. As they walked into their cabin, their home, their sanctuary, their proof that love could conquer even the most impossible odds, Sarah offered up one final prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided her to this mountain, and this man. She had climbed up here to save her son. Instead, she had saved herself, and found in the process that sometimes the most desperate journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations.